Hello, thank you for checking out our video in our series of the RevRec Reimagined video and podcast series. Today, we're going to focus on the core aspects of the updates to the five-step model. My name is John Froelich, and I am a Senior Vice President here at Bramisol, and I've been doing revenue recognition for almost 14 years now, and I'm excited to share some of these updates that we've seen over the past several years with you. Let's take a moment to remind everybody what is the five-step model, because it's the core of ASC 606 and IFRS 15. Number one is identifying the contract with the customer. That's crucial to understanding who exactly are you dealing with and what is that end contract. You then want to take step two, which is identifying the separate performance obligations. What is it exactly you're selling to the customer and what value are they getting? What is the customer paying for that? What is the actual transaction price for the entire bundle that you're selling? Next, you want to allocate that transaction price. So how does that transaction price get allocated using standard tools such as standalone selling price? This is one of the core changes that have been implemented through the new regulations. And finally, recognizing that revenue when appropriate, whether it's a time-based, event-based, or percent of complete-based performance obligation. What we found over the years is many of our customers in the beginning really spent a lot of time thinking just about how they would recognize the revenue and when they would recognize the revenue, whether it was an event or a time or a percent of complete or milestone billing. And they didn't spend enough time thinking about the left-hand side, really understanding what is the purpose of this process to really identify the customers and walk through all of the steps. And we spent a lot of time with them really focused in on helping ascertain all of the different steps that fit in this process. Now, over the past 6 to 7 years, or 5 to 7 years, since compliance started in the 2017-18 timeframe, we've learned a lot more. And of course, change is always the rule. And with change, we see some impacts on the five-step model itself, and we thought we would share some of that with you. Remember that step one is identifying that contract with the customer. Well, part of what we've learned from this space is who is the customer? Early on, of course, we learned about principal versus agent, sell-to, sell-through models. But as we've seen, many of our companies are evolving into revenue sharing models. How does revenue sharing, when you're sharing that revenue with another entity, such as selling a media service and selling it through a number of different medias, you could sell your licenses through Google, Apple, or many different others. What happens when you have an extremely complex enterprise that has multiple contracts with entities? What's the master contract? How does it relate? How do you want to identify things like intercompany revenue? All of that is something to be thought about. And then, of course, licensing and royalties. Early on, of course, licensing and royalties was an issue and challenge for many of our clients in the media and telecom space. But this is beginning to be an issue and opportunity for companies in industries such as high tech, semiconductor, medical device. So really it's about seeing the expansion of that and how businesses are changing their models. In step two, we want to identify those separate performance obligations. And early on, that was pretty straightforward. You either had time, event, or POC type. Now we're starting to see hybrid, where something that is a time-based event is really more like an event. It's a series of events over a period of time because the customer may buy or take possession of that POB at different times in different spaces. We're also starting to see, now that we see the subscription economy or consumption-based outcomes, we're starting to see more and more linked and nested. What does that mean? Well, it means that a master POB, such as a sale of a software, could have multiple elements underneath it, including availability for upgrades or other different services or material rights to buying those other items. How do you identify what those performance obligations are? Determining the transaction price. This would seem pretty simple and straightforward, and in the beginning it was a little bit simpler. You figured out what did you sell it for, and that's what the price was. But how do you begin to give value when you're moving towards more subscriptions? What happens and what's the value of an evergreen subscription, a subscription that auto renews? What happens when you have usage and consumption-based or commit-based contracts? And how do you manage that process using the different tools in revenue accounting? And what are the implications upstream? And finally, tiered pricing and bundles. If you have a contract that's based on a specific tiered pricing model, what happens when the customer either buys less or more of that? What happens if you do different bundles, and how does that affect and change your transaction price? And of course, has implications to how do you allocate standalone selling price? Standalone selling price, we have seen many different evolutions of that process. Early on, it was very clear there was a standalone selling price, but the process has allowed for different approaches to that. And we, of course, have seen people get rather creative about that. Another element that has come up recently is significant financing components, where you sell something up front, you collect the money up front, but you have to recognize the financing, quote unquote, of that over time. And of course, lessor models, as they become more and more frequent, also take advantage of that same process. And then how do you allocate, again, that consumption usage model when you don't know exactly how much it's going to be? What are some of the steps you can take to make some assumptions? And finally, it would be easy to recognize that revenue when the performance obligation is satisfied. But we've seen a number of different options here in which companies explore what is my contract date versus what does my bill plan say? Am I using sales orders or invoices to drive that? Or am I using, in the case of intercompany, different acquisition methodologies, such as stock transfer orders? How do free trials and free periods affect when you recognize something in terms of revenue? How does that affect the allocation? How does it drive all of that? And then, of course, because you're giving the power to the customer in the new model, what are the implications of cancellations? The point of all of this is really to share with you as a customer and a prospect and an expert in revenue accounting, really a view of how the model has changed over time, how it is beginning to be affected. The core elements remain the same, yet the continuing evolution of these models and insights has led to thinking about each of these differently. Yet it remains a great construct in which to think about your revenue recognition processes. In addition to that, what we would also suggest is you think about this new model or this new approach and framework, which we call the volume velocity methodology or approach. And key to that is really understanding how these four dimensions can affect the materiality, the amount of work, and the importance of each of the various elements. And of course, underlying that is change. We're going to talk about this in a separate episode of this RevRec Reimagined series, but I wanted to share with you some insights that affect it. So thank you very much for listening in. I hope you got some great insights on the effects of the new business models and the new economy on the five-step model. We encourage you to follow up by checking out Bramisol's website at www.bramisol.com. Or our YouTube channel. You can check out all of our videos on a number of different topics. Thank you for downloading. Thank you for listening, and hope you have a great day.